The book we are reading is Classic Starts, Pinocchio, retold from the Carlo Collodi original by Tanya Zamorsky. Chapter 1, The Piece of Wood That Laughed and Cried. This is not a story about a great and brave king, little ones. It is not a tale about a princess. No, believe it or not, it is a story about a piece of wood, and not even a fancy piece of wood at that, just a simple little log, the kind that makes cold rooms cozier when placed into a roaring fireplace in the winter. This particular piece of wood happened to live in a little carpentry shop owned by Mr. Antonio, whose nose was so round and red and ripe-looking that some people called him Mr. Cherry after the fruit. Mr. Antonio had big plans for that little piece of wood. He intended to turn it into a leg for his coffee table. But just as he raised his axe and was about to chop, he heard a tiny little voice say, "Oh, please, not too hard. Mr. Antonio spun around, but he couldn't see who had spoken. He looked under his workbench, inside the closet, and even sifted through a pile of sawdust, but he found no one. He opened the door and looked up and down the street. Still no one. Deciding that he had imagined it, Mr. Antonio raised his axe again. This time he struck the wood. "Ow!" wailed the same wee voice. This was too much for Mr. Antonio. He was so scared now that his eyes bulged like balloons, his stuttering mouth fell open, and his tongue hung out over his lower lip. "Is there someone hiding inside this wood?" he shrieked. "If so, I'll fix you." Mr. Antonio threw the wood on the floor, then smashed it against the walls, and even banged it against the ceiling. "What do you have to say about that?" he asked, feeling slightly silly to be talking to a piece of wood. There was no reply. Mr. Antonio sat perfectly still and waited for an additional 10 minutes. But there was still nothing. "I did imagine it," he concluded with relief. Taking some sandpaper, Mr. Antonio began to smooth and shape the cut wood. And wouldn't you know it, the little voice came back. This time it was giggling. "Oh, hee hee, ha ha," it said. "Stop it. That sandpaper tickles my sensitive skin." This was the last straw. Poor Mr. Antonio was so confused and upset that he fell to the floor, his bright red nose turning blue. At that moment Mr. Cherry looked more like Mr. Blueberry. Just then there was a knock at the door. It was Mr. Antonio's friend Geppetto. Geppetto was a jolly old man with a nickname of his own. The boys in the neighborhood teased him and called him Polodina, the Italian word for polenta, because his yellow wig looked like a bowl of that cornmeal mush. Geppetto hated this nickname and flew into a rage whenever anyone used it. Of course, this only made people do it more often. "My friend," Geppetto asked Mr. Antonio as he entered, "what are you doing on the floor?" "What do you think I'm doing?" Antonio joked. "I fell down. What brings you here?" "My legs," Geppetto joked back. "I have something very exciting to tell you. I've decided to make a puppet, one that can dance and do flips in the air. Together we will travel the world and become rich and famous. What do you think?" "Sounds like a great plan, Polodina," yelled you-know-who. Mr. Geppetto's face turned bright red. "What did you call me?" he asked his friend. "I didn't say a word," Mr. Antonio replied truthfully. "You called me Polodina," Geppetto growled. Mr. Antonio said, "No, I didn't." "Yes, you did," Geppetto yelled. This happened a few times, the men growing angrier each time. Eventually the words turned to blows and bites, slaps and kicks, shrieks and scratches. When the fight was over, the men realized that each was holding each other's wig. "Let's give each other back our hair," Mr. Antonio suggested. "Good idea, my friend," Geppetto replied, and soon each man's hair was his own again. "Listen," Mr. Antonio said, "I've just made the thing for your puppet you are planning to make. Mr. Antonio went to his bench to get the piece of wood. Just as he was about to hand it over, however, it slipped out of his hands and violently smacked Geppetto in the shins. "What kind of friend hits another with a piece of wood?" Geppetto asked. "I didn't do it," Mr. Antonio said. "Yes, you did," Geppetto shouted. "It was the wood's fault, not mine," Mr. Antonio insisted. "And even though I didn't do so before, if you don't believe me, I will call you Polodina." Geppetto promptly called Mr. Antonio an idiot, a donkey, and an extremely ugly monkey. Mr. Antonio stuck to Polodina, and another fight started. When it was over, both wigs were still on their rightful heads, but the bodies below them had many bruises, and the shirts had quite a few missing buttons. "We're getting too old for this," Geppetto said, dusting himself off. "Yes, we are." The two friends were finally in agreement, and with that Geppetto took his new piece of wood and happily limped home. Chapter 2. The Prankster Puppet is Born. Geppetto lived in a small, simple house. The only thing rich about him was his imagination. Instead of a real fireplace, he had painted one on the wall. Over the fake fire, instead of a real pot full of real food, was a painted pot. It was bubbling over so beautifully that you could almost smell the delicious stew painted inside. Geppetto couldn't wait to get started carving and painting his puppet. He even had the perfect name picked out, Pinocchio. Upon placing the finishing touches on Pinocchio's eyes, Geppetto was surprised to see the eyes blinking and staring back at him. "What are you staring at?" Geppetto asked, but there was no response. Next, Geppetto painted the puppet's perfect little nub of a nose. To his surprise, the still wet nose immediately began to grow. Geppetto kept trimming it, but he couldn't keep up. Soon the little nub looked more like a long, narrow needle. Ducking away from the still growing nose, Geppetto gave up and started painting the puppet's mouth. As soon as the mouth was finished, however, it began to laugh and make fun of its maker. "Stop it," Geppetto said angrily. And how did the mouth respond? One very long tongue. Geppetto decided he would ignore this bad behavior. After all, he had a great deal more work to do. As he was finishing the puppet's delicate fingertips, Geppetto felt a cool breeze on his bald head. Why, the puppet had used his brand new hands to pull off his maker's wig. Pinocchio put the hair on his own head, which was so much smaller than Geppetto's head that half the puppet was promptly hidden. Geppetto was getting slightly nervous. He wasn't even done making his wooden doll, and already the creature was misbehaving. Geppetto probably should have considered such risks before he'd started, but it was too late now. Retrieving his stolen wig and placing it back on his own head, Geppetto bent down to paint and polish Pinocchio's legs and feet. And wouldn't you know it, as soon as those feet were finished, one of them flew up and kicked Geppetto right in the nose. "I must be patient," Geppetto told himself, just as one is with a little baby. Taking the puppet under his arm, Geppetto put him on the floor and showed him how to walk. He learned just like a human child, bit by bit, one foot after the other. Bit by bit, one foot after the other. Unlike a human child, however, Pinocchio got the hang of that walking business in no time at all, and quickly graduated to running around the room. In fact, he ran right out the open door and down the street. Geppetto tried to catch him, but it was no use. That puppet ran like the wind. Instead of stopping him, as Geppetto begged, the townspeople just stepped aside and stared and laughed. Pinocchio ran and ran. In fact, he ran right into the legs of a policeman, who did not take too kindly to runaway puppets. Grabbing Pinocchio by the nose, which made a perfect handle, he held him still until Geppetto reached the scene. Geppetto thanked the officer. To Pinocchio, he said, "Young man, you and I are going to settle this when we get home." Pinocchio threw himself on the ground and refused to move. "Help!" he cried. "Don't let this mean man take me." A concerned crowd gathered around. "Shame on you, Geppetto," they cried. "Of course he doesn't want to go home if you're only going to hit him." "Who said anything about hitting?" Geppetto asked. But "Yes," he cried, "my father beats me terribly." The policeman, who took even less kindly to poor parents than to runaway puppets, now came and grabbed Geppetto. "Ungrateful boy," Geppetto cried as he was dragged away to jail. "To think that I tried so hard to make the perfect puppet." With his father in prison, Pinocchio was free to do as he liked. Running through the fields like a wild and happy billy goat, he raced home, locked the door behind him, and threw himself on the couch. "This is the life," he sighed. Just then he heard someone saying, "Crick, crick, crick." Looking around, he saw a big cricket crawling up the wall. "Is that you making that sound?" Pinocchio demanded. "It is," Cricket replied, "and I will have you know that I've been living in this room and making that sound for well over 100 years. "Well, it's my room now," Pinocchio said, "so I suggest you stop talking and get out." "Shame on you," Cricket said, "the way you disobeyed your father and ran away from home." "Keep cricking, silly bug," Pinocchio replied. "Tomorrow I will run away again. Do you really think I'm going to stay here and get sent to school and forced to study? I'm going to play and chase butterflies and climb trees all day." "You are the silly one," Cricket insisted. "If you don't go to school, you'll turn into a stupid donkey and everyone will laugh at you. At the very least, you should learn a trade, a skill of some sort, so you can earn an honest living." "Good idea," Pinocchio replied, and it seemed as if he was serious. "You know what trade I'll learn?" "What?" Cricket asked. "The trade of being a bum," Pinocchio screamed, laughing. "I'll be a professional eater, drinker, and sleeper. So there." The smart old Cricket sighed. "Oh, Pinocchio," he said sadly, "those trades will only send you to the hospital or to prison." "You are making me angry," Pinocchio warned him. But Cricket was getting angry too. "I feel sorry for you," he continued, "with your wooden head." In a fit of temper, Pinocchio leapt up, grabbed Geppetto's hammer, and threw it at Cricket. But, thankfully, Pinocchio's aim was not as fine as his temper. "You missed me by a mile," Cricket huffed, unharmed, and promptly left the house. As night fell, a queer feeling settled over Pinocchio's stomach. "What is that?" Pinocchio wondered. Then he remembered he hadn't had anything to eat the entire time he'd been alive. "I'm absolutely starving," he realized. "Oh, if my father was here to make me dinner." He ran over to the fireplace where the pot was bubbling over, but when he reached out to touch it, he discovered it was only a delicious-looking painting. Pinocchio ran all around the house, looking for even the smallest scrap of bread, but there was nothing. He was positively dizzy with hunger. Cricket was right, he thought, and started to cry. It was wrong of me to disobey my father and run away from home. Suddenly, in the corner of the room, Pinocchio saw something round and white. "An egg!" he cried. "I'm saved!" "And now, how should I cook you?" Pinocchio asked the egg. "Should I fry you, or boil you, or poach you?" Deciding that poaching would be the fastest method, Pinocchio placed a pan filled with stove, turned on the heat, and cracked the egg on the side of the pan. But instead of the uncooked yolk Pinocchio expected, out came a fluffy white chick, grinning broadly. "Why, thank you, Puppet," the chick said, stretching and bowing. "I thought I would have to break that shell myself." Wishing Pinocchio good luck and bidding him goodbye, the little chick spread his wings and flew straight out the window. Staring after his escaped dinner, Pinocchio began to whine and stomp his wooden feet, but the noise he made was not loud enough to drown out his growling stomach. "Oh," he thought, "if only Cricket was still here, maybe he could have made me some dinner." Pinocchio decided he would go for a walk to the village. If he begged, perhaps someone would give him a bit of bread. It was cold and stormy, not the best of nights to be outside begging for bread. Pinocchio was afraid of the dark and of storms, and it was getting late, but he was so hungry he set out in search of food anyway. He ran as fast as his little wooden legs would carry him. When he got to the village, the streets were dark and deserted. All the stores were closed. Pinocchio ran up to a door and rang the bell wildly. Someone had to answer. An old man in his pajamas opened a second-story window and looked out. "Who's there?" he shouted down angrily. "What do you want at this time of night?" "I know it's late, but could you please give me a bit of bread?" Pinocchio called up. "I am so terribly hungry." "Wait right there," the old man said, and Pinocchio thought he was saved. "I'll throw something down." Pinocchio stood under the window preparing to catch his delicious dinner. Instead, he felt a shower of ice-cold water pouring down on his poor wooden head. Looking up, he saw the old man holding a now empty pot upside down. "That will teach you to ring people's doorbells when they're peacefully asleep," the man yelled. Upset, the soaking wet puppet walked back home. Once inside, he sat down on Geppetto's little wooden stool and put his 2 feet up on the stove to dry them. The fire felt so nice and warm on his cold toes. But they were, after all, cold wooden toes, and when he fell asleep, a spark from the fire landed on them, and they began to burn. While Pinocchio snored happily away, not feeling a thing, his feet blackened, then turned to ash. At dawn, a loud knocking at the door woke Pinocchio. "Who is it?" he called, yelling and rubbing his sleepy eyes. "It is I," a voice replied. It was Geppetto's voice. Pinocchio was so excited he jumped up to run to the door. He didn't know yet his feet were gone, but because they were, he tripped and hit the floor with an enormous bang. "Open the door for me," Geppetto shouted. "Oh, Father, I can't," Pinocchio cried, rolling around footless on the floor. "Why can't you?" Pinocchio spotted a cat playing in a pile of wood chips in the corner. "The cat has eaten my feet," he replied. "Open this door," Geppetto warned, "or you'll go to bed tonight without supper." "Oh, Father, please believe me, I cannot stand up." Finally Geppetto entered through a window. Seeing that Pinocchio was telling the truth, he felt horrible. Picking up his puppet, Geppetto cried as he rubbed Pinocchio's wooden head. "How did this happen?" he asked. Pinocchio wasn't sure. In between sobs, he told his father all about his night. When he mentioned putting his feet up on the stove to dry them, Geppetto said, "Ah, now my feet are gone, but my hunger still isn't," Pinocchio finished. Geppetto put 3 pears out of his pocket. He'd been saving them for his own breakfast, but his son was hungry. Pinocchio instantly perked up. Almost immediately, though, he had a demand. "I do not eat pears that haven't been peeled," he told his father. Geppetto was surprised. "Are you really such a fusspot?" he asked. "In this world, my boy, we must learn to eat everything, because we never know when we might find ourselves hungry again." "But I don't like the skins," Pinocchio insisted. "Please, won't you peel them for me?" So Geppetto took out his knife and peeled the pears, leaving the skins on the table. When he finished with the first pear, Pinocchio started to throw the core away, but Geppetto stopped him. "Don't throw that core away. We may have some use for it." Pinocchio grew enraged. First the peels and now this. Do you really imagine that I, Pinocchio, would ever eat a pear core? He sniffed. Never say never, Geppetto said, and placed the pear cores next to the skins on the table. Well, wouldn't you know it, a few minutes later, Pinocchio was still hungry. Is there anything else to eat? He whined. Only the skins and cores, Geppetto replied calmly. Oh, all right, Pinocchio cried. He picked up a piece of peel and then a core and started to nibble them. He complained to himself and made faces with every bite, but before he knew it, he had devoured every last bit of both and felt undoubtedly better. I don't want to say I told you so, Geppetto said, but after all, I did. We hope that you are enjoying our chapter a week story. Call again every week for a new chapter.